Welcome to Go and Do. I'm your host, Ajalan Joy Stapley, and it's 2025. Where every schmuck and his brother has a podcast. So why not me? Why not me? Here at Go and Do, we talk about politics, culture, family, and faith and how they all connect from a faith-affirming, pro-America, traditional value, member of the Church of Jesus Christ perspective. Have you asked yourself lately, why can't we just get along? Why can't Americans just agree to disagree like we once did? You see, I grew up in a wonderful time called the 1990s where you could disagree on things passionately and still be friends, where politics was not discussed at the dinner table, let alone the lunchroom table, and where you didn't cut people out of your life or out of your family simply because who they voted for. Things have changed. Why is that? In my studies, I have come to discover that there is one main reason why that is the case. Now, there are several that play into this, but there is one that stands out above the rest. Marxism. Yes, communism. Now, before you turn me off and say, AJ, you're crazy, ask yourself, can you name 10 facts about communism? Can you name 5? I couldn't until a few years ago, and I am a huge history buff. Taught social studies. I could talk to you for an hour straight about World War II and the Holocaust and Nazis, but I couldn't do that about communism. Let me read you a couple quotes from prophets of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and hear what they have to say. This one's from Ezra Taft Benson from 1961. He said, "It is time, therefore, that every American, and especially every member of the priesthood, become informed about the aims, tactics, and schemes of socialistic communism. This becomes particularly important when it is realized that communism is turning out to be the earthly image of the plan which Satan presented in the pre-existence. The whole program of socialistic communism is essentially a war against God and the plan of salvation, the very plan which we fought to uphold during the war in heaven." Next one. This is from President David O. McKay from 1953, so before the last one. "It is not the government's duty to support you." I'm going to say that louder. "It is not the government's duty to support you. I will raise my voice as long as God gives me sound or ability against this communistic idea that the government will take care of us all. It is wrong! Exclamation point. No wonder in trying to perpetuate that idea that men become antichrist, because those teachings strike directly at the doctrines of the Savior." What we are seeing today is a cultural Marxist revolution here in America. I am not suggesting that what we are seeing has any overt resemblance to communism as you may imagine it or as you may know it. However, we have seen a cultural revolution brought about by neo-Marxist theories that were taught in universities and now have seeped into the culture. And I'm going to prove to you, in not one, not two, but in four episodes, how the modern left, how the American Democrat is peddling repackaged and recycled Marxism in the form of wokeism. Yes, that wokeism is Marxism, repackaged, recycled, and ready to take on the West, or rather to destroy the West. And to do that, we have to go all the way back to Marx himself and then walk through to modern time. So that is why we're taking 4 episodes to do that. So the first episode, which today, we will start with Karl Marx himself, the manifesto, how Marxism is more of a religion than an economic system, and the first country to implement it, Russia, what it looked like to get in there, and what were the results of communism in practice. The next episode after this, we will go to Asia and how communism infiltrated Asia, specifically what psychological indoctrination took place in several Asian countries to convince people, particularly young people, to not just follow the communist agenda, but to turn on their fellow countrymen in some of the most horrific ways I've heard about. The next episode, we will talk about the Cold War between America and the Soviets. We will look at what the followers of communism will do, what links they take to spread their ideology and to maintain power, specifically through espionage and propaganda. This is like James Bond, 60s James Bond stuff. And lastly, we will take a very long time to start with America, the turn of the 20th century to now, and look at how the left grew the federal government. Also, how at the same time, European Marxists were bringing over their ideology into American universities and how this was taught, resulting in these familiar neo Marxist theories: sexual revolution, Black liberation theory, feminism, CRT, gender theory, all of them. We're going to go through all of them. Now, I need to add that I am not an expert in all these things. However, I do have a fully functioning brain and I know how to read, which is more than I can say for about half the country. I've been studying this for years. I have several links in the bottom of this video. Every episode, I will include my sources, and I am telling you, do not take my word for it. Investigate yourself and find out for yourself. Now, as we go through today, I want you to pay attention to a couple things. One, what was communism selling? What was it promising? What did it actually deliver? What tactics did they use to see their vision come to life? And specifically, who was pushing this? And do you see any comparisons to today? Now, before we even get into Marx and communism, we first want to differentiate between communism, socialism, and fascism. Now, if you're familiar with politics, you have heard the right refer to the left as Marxist or communist. If you have not been living under a rock the last decade, you've heard the left call the right fascist. And where does socialism fit in all this? So let's do a quick little comparison of these systems of government. First one we're going to talk about is capitalistic government, which is what America was founded on, what we should be. So in a capitalistic government, you have private property is allowed. The free market is supported. And by free market, that just means that buyers and sellers can exchange goods and services without government interference. As you can tell, that's not so much the case anymore, but that was the goal. Private property is allowed, supports the free market, and limited government role. That is a capitalistic government. Socialism is where there is little or no private property. The government owns and operates most services through high taxes and wealth redistribution. Marxism is the theory put forth by Karl Marx that, when put into practice, is communism. And in communism, there's no private property. The government owns and is in charge of all goods and services, and there's no class distinction. There's supposed to be no class distinction. Okay, that's communism. What's fascism? Fascism is led by an authoritarian government where you do allow private property. You do have enterprise, small businesses, big corporations. However, they are heavily controlled or dictated by the government, by the state. There is a class distinction, and there also is a very strict nationalism. And nationalism is just a couple steps above patriotism, where it's a few steps above patriotism, where you not just love your country, but you lose your individual identity for your national identity. And your country, your government, your state pushes that state identity, whatever was decided upon by the people in charge, the ruling class or individual, and you push that identity to the detriment of your own citizens and to other nations. So today it is commonplace to see this when looking at the political spectrums. You have communism on the far left, followed by socialism, and then capitalism, and then fascism on the far right. So they are seen as opposites. Why is that? Well, a couple reasons. First reason is during World War II, Hitler's fascist Germany and Stalin's communist Russia were arch enemies. They ideologically were at war. with one another, and they were literally at war one with another. And this wasn't because one was bad and one was good. They're both bad. They both have the same end goal, just different means.
Gee, mate, what do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
So the left calls fascism a right-wing system, and there's those on the right who are saying, no, that's not actually true. Here's why. The creator of fascism was a man named Giovanni Gentile, who was very heavily influenced by Marx. He said, quote, fascism is a form of socialism. Remember, that's on the left side. In fact, it is its most viable form. He looked at fascism more like socialism with a national identity, where you could basically control the businesses, enterprise, and use it for the directives of the state. And that's the biggest difference, is there's absolute government control in a fascist society. And the more government control there is, the less freedoms the citizen has. So Gentile was able to implement his fascism under Benito Mussolini in Italy. That was the first fascist government. Gentile worked in Mussolini's government, and together they helped develop this ideology as well as implement it. As far as Mussolini goes, he spent his entire political career as a left-wing Marxist socialist. He was an official member of the Italian Socialist Party until he was expelled.
You're fired.
They started the National Fascist Party in Italy. Mussolini says, quote, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing above the state. Remember, socialism is admittedly just to the right of communism, where the government owns and operates most services. In 1939, Italy saw the highest rate of state-owned enterprises, second to, guess who? The Soviet Union. So there was communist Soviets, and then fascist Italy had the highest state-owned businesses, enterprises. Also, Mussolini doubled the number of Italian bureaucrats during his time. So in 1934, 1 in every 5 Italians worked for the government. Speaking of bureaucrats, how about that Doge? Man, are you following the millions upon millions of things that Elon Musk is finding? Woo! Conservatives love Doge. You know who hates it? The left. In 2024, according to Pew Research Center, guess how many federal employees there were? Guess how many? Not including the military. There's about 1.3 million active duty military. So not including them, how many government employees were there under Joe Biden in 2024? 3 million. About 1.9% of the US population. That means the federal government is the largest employer, larger than Amazon, Walmart, McDonald's. That's not conservatism. When it comes to fascism, I really like Cleon Skousen's view. Cleon Skousen was a prominent LDS scholar on constitution, history, communism. He worked for the FBI in the 1940s, authored many books, including this one, which is one of my primary sources. I strongly recommend it. But he described fascism like this. And remember, he lived through it. He said, now fascism is to the right of communism, but only about half an inch. Like this diagram here from the Foundation of Economic Education, where you see communism, far left, followed by socialism and then fascism. So some modern day examples of these governments of communism would be China, North Korea, Vietnam. Socialism, think Venezuela, Bangladesh, Nicaragua. That's a hard word. Mixed economy, that's more like the UK or Canada, where they have a very strong nanny state provided by high taxes, but they still do allow for an open market. Followed by capitalism, which the United States should be. It's what we were founded on. And sadly, we have strayed from this because we are more a mixed economy than capitalism. A strictly capitalist nation would be like Singapore or Hong Kong. So when you look at the size and the scope of the government, the bigger the government, the smaller the citizen, the smaller freedoms we have, the less freedoms we have. That's the gist when I look at the system of government. So people will tell you all sorts of things about how No, fascism is on the right, da 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 da. Just look at how much control the government has, because as constitutional conservatives, we want small government. That is what the framers intended, and we have strayed from that. So next time someone calls you fascist, just tell them they're an idiot. Tell them you are a free market, small government, constitutional conservative. All right, that takes us to Karl Marx, the man, the myth, the author of some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Now, as we go through his life briefly, I want you to think of the scripture in Matthew. By their fruits shall ye know them. Other than communism, what fruits do you see in Karl Marx's life? Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Germany to Jewish parents who were culturally Jewish, and to escape anti-Semitism, they converted to Christianity. When Marx was 6, he later became an atheist. Put a pin in that. Marx was born to Marx's family was upper middle class. They did very well for themselves. As a boy, he was described as intense and unable to keep friends. I can't imagine why. He studied law in college, mostly to appease his father, and then was kicked out for drunkenness. His went to the University of Berlin after that to follow his true passion, philosophy. There, he found with a group of philosophers who were staunch anti-God and anti-Christian. He started publishing writings, which were then banned for being so radical. Realized in 1843 if he wanted to continue his political activism, he needed to leave Germany. So he moved to Paris. There, he kept writing, kept up with his political activities, working with other anarchist revolutionaries. Didn't hold down a long-term job. He did some journalist. That was the main way not the main way, but that was his longest running job, was as a journalist. Okay. That's important. In 1844, he met Frederick Engels, who went on to become his close friend, confidant, co-authored the Communist Manifesto, also his sugar daddy.
Hey, fellas! Look what I found in my pocket!
During this time, there were revolutions breaking out in Europe, and they were seen as connected with Marx's writings. So the government kicked him out again. He got kicked out of Paris, moved to Brussels. There, he continued to write with Frederick Engels, and they together published the Communist Manifesto. He got kicked out again of Brussels and moved to England, which is ironic, as Thomas Sowell points out, because England was a very capitalist nation at the time, and his entire theology of communism is anti-capitalism. However, the only place that he could go live freely was a capitalist nation. Now, this man lived off his inheritances, gifts from his family, his wife's family, from friends, particularly Engels, and a whole bunch of credit. That is basically how he sustained his life. That's not an exaggeration. Both Marx and Engels were estranged from their family. Marx more his mom, Engels more his dad. Despite this, Engels went and took a job from his dad and lived very comfortably and was able to continue to finance Marx during this time. And then when Engels was about 50, he retired comfortably and then was able to pay for Marx's retirement to live a comfortable life. Okay. So when Marx was older, he lived comfortably thanks to Frederick Engels, sugar daddy. Until then, Marx lived for about 20 years in the slums of England with his family, living in abject poverty. He seldom could come up with money for groceries or rent or bills. He had 3 very young kids die tragically, and he didn't even have the money to bury one of them. He had to be gifted that from someone else. He dodged and denounced his creditors. He was just kind of a lowlife. And the sad thing is his income was sufficient for a good one. His mother, for example, despite her son's disdain for him, once gave Marx an advance on his future inheritance that was enough for his family to live very comfortably for years, and it was gone in less than 1 year. Another time, he received a very large inheritance that could have paid off his many, many, many debts. But 4 years later, he still had debts. What did he do? Right? I've heard that the measure of a man is how he takes care of his family. So during this time, what did Marx do? He spent his days at the library at the British Museum, studying economics, reading, spent his nights writing. He was very, very, very heavy drinker. His mother-in-law gifted them a maid who, despite being they were unable to pay her, she remained loyal throughout her life. Karl Marx knocked her up in 1851 while his wife was pregnant as well. Marx had the baby sent away, had no part in the boy's life. He's just a great guy. He's just a great guy. He was known for blaming other people for his problems. He blamed his infant son's death on bourgeois misery. In a letter to Engels about his mother's death, he didn't even talk about her death. He just talked about the inheritance that he felt entitled to. And that is a word that basically describes Marx, is entitled. And this man authored the ideology that has affected the 20th century, that is still affecting America today. And he is nothing more than an entitled fake. Fake in that he blamed and criticized the bourgeoisie. He was bourgeoisie. He claimed to speak for the working man, even though he had never spent a day working in his life. He became the voice of the laborers, and he never labored. He basically epitomizes a self-serving, poor me, victim mentality, doesn't take responsibility of his decisions person. Does this sound familiar? He's the original leftist. A colleague of Marx once said this about him. Mr. Marx does not believe in God, but he believes deeply in himself. His heart is filled not with love, but with rancor. He has very little benevolence towards men and becomes furious and spiteful when anyone dares question the omniscience of the divinity whom he adores, that is to say, Marx himself. Or as I've heard it explained, he and Engels were godless men who viewed themselves as God. Now, you're going to hear me harp on intellectuals and academia a lot today. And that's not to say that they're bad people by any means. To be learned is good, as we learn in 2 Nephi, as long as we hearken to the counsels of God. And sadly, in the past and in the present, the more learned people become, the less they hearken to God and even completely dismiss him or denounce him, and then start to see themselves as such. And that's where the problem takes hold. So there's a reason communism resonates with people. I've heard it described that communism marries a truth to a lie. When I was in elementary school, I remember sitting in class learning about communism thinking, this sounds really familiar. This sounds just like what I learned about in Sunday school, about church history, doctrine and covenants, and the law of consecration, where everyone works, they turn in their stuff, and then it's distributed to make sure that everyone has what they needed. And there's no poor, there's no rich, everyone's equal. I was kind of confused. So socialism has good goals. It's just how you get there. Hence, it is a counterfeit. President Ezra Taft Benson says this. Said, whenever the God of heaven reveals his gospel to mankind, Satan, the archenemy to Christ, introduces a counterfeit. Communism introduced into the world a substitute for true religion. It is a counterfeit of the gospel plan. The false prophets of communism predict a utopian society. This, they proclaim, will only be brought about as capitalism and free enterprise are overthrown, private property abolished, the family as a social unit eliminated, all classes abolished, all governments overthrown, and a communal ownership of property in a classless, stateless society. That is what communism is selling. The world that Marx was raised in had its fair share of suffering and inequality. Marx was born at the height of the industrial age. The European monarchs were crumbling. There was a lot of upheaval. This new economic trend was bursting, where people moved from the countryside to the city. Individual producers were replaced with factories. And during this time, a new class emerged that Marx labeled bourgeoisie. These were upper class landowners, business owners, and the lower class he labeled proletariat, the working class, the peasants. So the rich were acquiring wealth unknown in the history of the world at this time. There was a rise in factories, which meant that there was a rise in factory workers who were moving to the cities, living in these crowded slums near the factories, and there was disease, there was suffering. This is the Europe that the Communist Manifesto was published into. When I first read the Communist Manifesto, I thought to myself, the guys who wrote this were very smart, but not as smart as they thought they were. And you could argue that I'm just not smart enough to get it, or it just went over my head, or it was, in fact, a bunch of word vomit, which I've come to recognize in a lot of left-wing writings.
CrossFit!
With the help of Engels, Marx developed not just an economic system or a model of government, but an entire world view. They developed a framework of ideas designed to explain basically everything in existence, not just economics and socioeconomics and history, but explain human behavior, morality, science, the origin of species, even the origin of the universe. They really thought that they had just come into it. Engels said about their theory that the last vestige of a creator external to the world is obliterated, as in they just got rid of him. There is no creator. Marx and Engels just proved that. And when you look at Karl Marx's influences, you can trace them back to the Enlightenment period, which is the period between 1600 to 1800. It's a scientific revolution where people started to focus more on reason and science and steer away from faith and superstition. In this time, materialism philosophy came about. And this hurts my head. It hurts my head. But this is materialism in simple terms. It's the belief that everything in the universe is made up of physical matter. So if it's not made up of physical matter, it doesn't matter. It's not real. So non-physical entities like a spirit or a soul or a divine being do not exist. It has to be physical and tangible. In essence, it's a worldview absent of God. People get lost in the minutia and the particulars about this, which is fine, but when you boil it down to its simplest form, Marxism is a worldview absent of God, which is why it has been so devastating for the last 100+ years. So Marx took materialism and then he added to it and created something called dialectic materialism, which basically is reality is material, physical, right? But it's also constantly changing. There's conflicts and contradictions, and that's basically an explanation for the world, which I thought was interesting because what do we learn about God? Well, God is a God of order. He's a God of patterns. He's a God of laws. And this worldview kind of sees the opposite of that. So Marx looked at the history of society and he saw class struggles, he saw divisions. And in his time, what was the big division? It was the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It was the haves and the have-nots. And they were at conflict with one another. Now, economically speaking, because that was huge for communism, for Marx, you have two groups. You have the group that owns the stuff to make the stuff and the group that uses the stuff to make the stuff. So the group that owns the stuff, they own the means of production. They own the land, the farms, the tools, the machinery, the factories. That's capital. Those are all just forms of capital. So they own the capital, or they are the capitalist. And not just the capitalist, but you have the entire class that benefits from capitalism, the bourgeoisie class. So you have this group right here. And then you have the people that use this stuff, the laborers, the workers, the peasants. And Marx, in his economic system, assign value only to the people that use the stuff. Okay. So it doesn't matter who owns the hammer, it matters who uses the hammer, because hammer's not going to hammer itself, right? So you could own 1,000 hammers, but it's useless unless you have manpower to wield it. And that's where you get the value and the wealth. I hope that's making sense. So these guys, in Marx's view, held no value. It was just this group right here. And not only did this group create, hence having value, this group made a profit off of their work, hence exploiting this group here. So in this worldview that is absent of God, it's also absent of Satan, but you still have good and evil, and you have to assign roles to those things. So in Marx's case, he took this class of people, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, people that benefited from capitalism, the owner of the means of production, this group right here, and he assigned them as evil, bad. So then naturally, who was assigned good? These guys over here. So these guys are good. Or I'm sorry, these guys are bad. These guys are good. These are the oppressors. These are the oppressed. These are the haves. These are the have-nots. You may be asking yourself, who cares? Why does this matter? No one talks like this. Means of production and what, no one talks like this. This has no relevance to modern day. And you are kind of right. They do talk like this in universities, in academic circles, even Teen Vogue. I read an article where they were explaining that capitalism is when the top 1% owns all the wealth, and communism is when like the workers own all the wealth. However, as I'll explain in episode 5, this has been shifted and evolved to what we see today in modern time. However, this was the gist. This is the basic. Owners of the means of production, they are bad. Workers, good. Okay, gotta remember that. So Marx saw that capitalism, this group right here, capitalism is what made them selfish. And that if we just did away with capitalism, that these guys wouldn't be selfish, they would be virtuous, that there would be no poor, no wealthy, everyone would be equal, it'd be sunshine, unicorns, and ponies.
Pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows. Pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows.
So how do we get to that? Well, Marx proposed that instead of waiting for a revolution to happen as he had seen throughout history, we just speed it up a little bit. Just give it a little nudge. So rather than waiting for the workers to realize that they're oppressed, we just remind them and we tell them that they are oppressed, and then the revolution happens. Society collapses, the government can be rebuilt, and it can be
pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows.
But first, Marx had a couple more things in his way: religion and the family. Both he saw as tools of the bourgeoisie to maintain power. He has attributed to have said the following: "My object in life is to dethrone God and to destroy capitalism." There's some debate on if he actually said that. He did say this: "Religion is the opium of the people," as in it is a distraction to keep them from looking at their life and realizing how bad they have it. It keeps them from being politically engaged and realizing that they are, in fact, oppressed. It keeps them from waking up to their victimhood. The Vladimir Lenin, who's the great student of Marx, said this: "All modern religions and churches, all and of every kind of religious organizations, are always considered by Marxism as the organs of bourgeois reaction, used for the protection of the exploitation and the stupefaction of the working class." So we also have to abolish the family, because the family keeps generational wealth going. It's built on private gain. So Marx envisioned once you got rid of that, then you could have. So how was this received? not by the intended audience. The impoverished working class did not latch onto this. You know who did? Disaffected bourgeoisie, upper class intellectuals. So people just like Marx. Turns out, as flawed as it was, capitalism did improve people's lives, and Marx and his followers were frustrated, quite frustrated, that the working class did not see how oppressed they were. They did not understand the vision that Marx was trying to push out. So they tried to speed it up. And that created a new socialist movement that pushed for revolution rather than reform. And that's the big difference between Marxist and socialist. Socialists, to their credit, even though I disagree with them wholeheartedly, push for reform, change via legal avenue. And Marxism pushes for change via revolution, violent avenues. Dennis Prager, you may have heard of him from Prager University, considers himself an expert on the left, which I would agree. He was recruited in college to go to the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain and smuggle out names of fellow Jews who wanted to escape. And in his years in study, he has boiled down leftism to this very succinct statement that I think explains it all. Affluence plus secularism equals boredom equals leftism. As in, wealth, privilege, a life of ease, plus a worldview absent of God or religion equals lack of direction, lack of fulfillment, cynicism. This then opens the door or leaves the door open for a faux religion to come in and fill and do something with their otherwise vapid life. That boils it down. We'll see that over and over again, all the way up to modern times. James Lindsay, who I strongly suggest listening to his podcast about communism, James Lindsay says that communism is the inversion of Christianity, in that government transforms society, which then transforms human behavior. And as Christians, we believe that no, that's not true. Christ transforms individuals and human behavior that then affects and transforms societies, that then creates a more effective government. Hence, it is a counterfeit. Well, now that we have that all figured out, on to Russia.
Every night is Hanukkah.
Now we're going to go slowly through Russia, and then we'll pick up the pace as we go through these other countries in later episodes, because as you'll see, there are patterns that just play over and over. So, life before communism in Russia was under the Tsar, and it was quite atrocious. The Tsar had absolute authority. There was a noble class who were above the law. They practiced serfdom, as in like Middle Ages serfdom. It was pretty harsh. They had Siberian camps for prisoners and people who were exiled. There were some positive changes in the 1860s. Tsar Alexander II passed some positive reforms. He did away with serfdom, did some judicial reform. There was some light. Some speculate on his motive.
But irregardless.
Sadly, it was too little too late, and he was assassinated. His son took over, and his son reversed all of his father's reforms and basically ruled with an iron fist. He died in 1894, and his son, Nicholas II, became the last Tsar. So at this point, we have three key players in this political conflict. We have the Tsarist government, we have the peasants, working class, and then we have the intelligentsia. And remember, I'm not ripping on intelligentsia. They can be a wonderful contribution to society, and then sometimes they can't. So the writers, academics, educated, they were calling for change, some for more peaceful, like strikes and protests, some for a little more violent, like riots and assassinations, which is what happened to Alexander II. So Marxism had been in Russia for about 20 years by this point, and you start to see seeds being sown. Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas, was the opposite of his dad. He was very weak and heavily influenced by his advisors, who advised him to take Russia into war with Japan in 1903. Russia was humiliated in 2 years. And this led for calls for some change by the Russian people. And to his credit, he responded with promise to create a constitution and an elected legislature. The Russian people basically wanted to have their voice heard and to be free. They didn't want to do away with the Tsar necessarily. They wanted something similar to England at the time, which was it's called a limited monarch. At the same time, Marxism was growing amongst the people, and 3 leaders emerged. Tell me if you notice some patterns. Vladimir Lenin, wealthy, college educated, embraced materialism and then Marxism, was raised Christian, later became an atheist. Leon Trotsky, wealthy, college educated, embraced materialism, eventually embraced Marxism, was raised culturally Jewish, went on to become an atheist. Joseph Stalin, not wealthy, went to seminary to become a priest, dropped out, became an atheist. So the intelligentsia group had 3 different groups among it. You had the liberal intellectuals who were committed to democracy. That's good. That's what you want. You had socialists who wanted legal changes, who wanted change through legal means. Okay. And then you had the group who wanted socialism through revolution and violence. That was the group that those 3 leaders were a part of, and that was the group who ended up winning that argument between the intelligentsia. So there were some improvements. Nicholas created a constitution, representatives were elected, he got rid of censorship, and peasants started to own land. So you start to see some good coming forward. It wasn't perfect, but there was some good change. Then Nicholas was ill-advised to enter World War I, and this pretty much broke the people's spirits. 1.5 million soldiers were killed, food shortages, devastation, all sorts of things created unrest and chaos, which is key for Marxism to thrive. You need unrest and you need chaos. Riots broke out, and eventually Nicholas was forced to renounce his throne. This did not lead to the communists taking control. This is important because we sometimes think that. A provisional government was set up to run the country at this time. And the 3 leaders that I just mentioned, they had actually been kicked out of the country earlier for their radical activity. And now that the Tsar was gone and there was a new government, they actually let all those who were banished come back, which was a mistake in this case. So they come back and they start riling up the people. And they start riling up the people and telling them that we need change now. We need change faster. We need change more aggressively. And so you have the provisional government that's trying to get this crazy country under control and kind of get the footings for democracy going. And then you have they were called the Bolsheviks at the time, but you have the Marxists who were pushing for change now in a very violent, aggressive way. Now, again, life had not been great before. And so you understand where people are coming from and why they want change and why they want it quickly. But you have to have order. So the provisional government is trying to have order, and they end up having to fight this group over here that's gaining support throughout the country. Also, I want to say that this bears no similarity to the founding of our nation, the great United States. I have seen and read and watched videos of people going on about how America was founded on violence and how is the great, America's revolution any different than what we're doing. There's no contest, okay? In America's founding, there were several things done to make our case known to King George. Multiple petitions were sent to King George. Benjamin Franklin took a petition to King George. A list of grievances was sent to King George asking for his help. And when that did not happen, they formally declared their independence and separation from King George and then sent him a copy of that. That is not the same as donning a black ski mask, throwing a Molotov cocktail at a cop car, and then beating a counter-protester with a lead pipe. You are not the same. Back to Russia.
I must break you.
So the provisional government over here, the Marxists over here, they were stirring up a bunch of support, and the army was away at World War I, and basically they took over. They ousted the provisional government, and that was it for Russia. So I want to take a minute and just grieve for these people for a second, because it really is tragic. The head of the provisional government said this when it was first started. Few should consider ourselves the happiest of men, for our generation finds itself in the happiest of period in Russian history. They really believed they were going to have a democracy. They really were going that way, and it was just kind of overthrown. And you're going to see that. And that's what makes Marxism such a gross ideology. What you do is you play on people's problems, you play on people's pain, real problems, real pain, and you basically clump it all together, very often throwing gas to the flame. And then you assess all the blame on this certain group, right? So at this point in time, it was the czar, and then it was the provincial government, right? So you have problems, you place blame for all of it, and then you say, we're going to fix it. We just need to get rid of those guys, and then the problem will be solved. Or if not get rid of them, you need to elect us, give us power, give us your money, fundraise, whatever it is, and we will eliminate all those problems. That's why it's effective, and that's what makes it such a dark belief system. So, now, Vladimir Lenin won the drawing of the straws, and he is now in charge of Russia. He pulls Russia out of World War I, confiscates all of the industry from all the private owners. That's the first step. He takes the land, he takes the livestock, he abolishes wages and money and creates this like in-kind bartering system. And then he nationalizes the means of production, which means the state now controls it. So instead of farmers producing grain, the state's in charge of the grain. The state's in charge of transportation. That's what nationalizing means. And then what do you do when it's nationalized? Well, you force people to work. These guys were actually forced to go to the farm to work the fields, and then they couldn't keep what they made or grew or sell it. They had to give it back to the government, who then gave them what they thought they needed to survive. And people didn't like this. There was some revolts and assassination attempts against Lenin. So to control that, he shed some blood. He created the secret police, which would later be known as the KGB, unleashed the army on people, and then he assassinated the Tsar and his family. You may have seen this recreated in certain movies or shows. It's quite gruesome. And when you think of by their fruit shall you know them, this basically epitomizes the fruit of Marxist. So Tsar Nicholas, he and his family had been basically under house arrest. The provincial government was trying to get them kicked out of the country, and they were done with them. So they were under house arrest, basically waiting for that to happen when the Marxists took over. And they brought them down to a basement in the late hours of the night or early hours in the morning, I can't remember, and they shot them. Them as in the Tsar, his wife, his 4 daughters, and his son. All the kids were ages 20 to 13, plus a few servants. And what's even grosser is that they shot them. That didn't do the job, so they finished it off with their bayonets. Teenage girls with their bayonets. It's disgusting. That wasn't all of it. So the secret police started to carry out executions of anyone suspected of opposing Lenin, anyone who had money, anyone that could be influential, anyone that was seen as a threat was taken out by Stalin. And an estimated 140,000 people were killed. Right off the bat, 140,000 people have now been killed. Now, we're unfamiliar with communism's death toll. We're pretty familiar with the Holocaust death toll. It's about 6 million Jews were murdered, and about 5 million non-Jews were murdered by the Nazis. But when you get into communism, you're going to start to see numbers that just blow those away. It's also important to note by this time, this is 1919, Lenin's been in charge for 2 years, that he and his associates are already looking to push communism into other countries. They want to push revolutions into the rest of the world, particularly the West. And they were able to topple some neighboring countries to kind of start the Soviet Union. But it didn't go much further than that. But it's important to know that that is their goal, is to spread their ideology. Back to Russia.
Love Russia, don't you?
Yes, sir.
Louder!
Yes, sir.
So in 1921 to 1922, they saw an inefficient economy. The grain production went down. Farmers didn't like being forced to work and not keep anything. So inefficiency of the government to run the economy and the farms, coupled with a drought, led to a massive famine. Massive. In 2 years, 5 million people died from starvation, from violent rebellions and squashing those rebellions, executions. There was cannibalism. It was not pretty. So by 1921, we're only 4 years into this new communist government, and Marx or Lenin had to admit that, well, maybe Marx was wrong. Maybe it was just word vomit after all. So Lenin actually reversed some of his policies, and he brought back more free market economy, and it was good. There was some relative prosperity. There was some bounce back from that atrocious 4 years. And this is important to understand because there's people today who decry capitalism with every fiber of their being. But the very first attempt at this mass communal society was failing. And what brought it back? It wasn't more socialism, it was capitalism. Okay, Lenin, he stopped nationalizing the industries. He allowed for small businesses, enterprises. He stopped doing price controls, and it helped. It worked. The economy was improving for like 2 seconds, and then he died of a stroke, 1924. So Joseph Stalin, well, there's a split between the party between Trotsky and Stalin. Stalin wins, and he reverses all those policies. And things don't go well. In addition to that, he targets a group called the kulaks, who were wealthy peasants. I'm doing air quotes for the wealthy part there. Started increasing their taxes, increased regulation, and then basically just took their farms and killed them. This is 50,000 men, women, and children. Then from 1930 to 1933, there was another famine. This one was even more horrific. And it was unique in that it was man-made. It has a name called Holodomor, which translates to extermination by hunger. And it was focused on the people of Ukraine. So Ukraine was one of those countries that Lenin was able to take over right away. And they did not like that. So in order to keep them in line, he started this campaign where basically he took the food that Ukraine grew, exported it out of the country, made it so that food couldn't go in and didn't leave enough for the people there in Ukraine, and it resulted in this mass famine, where approximately 6 to 9 million people starved. 6 to 9 million. I'm glossing over this, but 6 to 9 million, most of which who were in Ukraine. Ukraine, which had once been the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, was now turned into scenes of carnage, bodies lining the streets, mass graves, cannibalism, theft, lawlessness. Horrific, absolutely horrific. So people weren't too happy with Stalin, and a coup started brewing amongst fellow communist officials. And when Stalin got wind of this, he ordered the execution of the officials involved, their families, their friends, their associates, their neighbors, anyone. And what became known as the Great Purge. And not just people who were planning to oust him. He had a secret police, his military, round up anyone who was seen as a threat, anyone who wasn't falling in line with what was told of them to do. Anyone he didn't like, minorities, intellectuals, wealthy peasants, anyone. So people were arrested. There were trials. There were show trials. There was no evidence. Basically, I'm going to accuse you of something that I know you didn't do and wait for you to confess. And if they weren't killed, a lot were sent to Siberia, to what was now known as the gulags. The secret police were intimidating citizens. They were torturing people, imprisonments. It was bad, very, very bad. And then in a brilliant, evil but brilliant move, he executed the executioners. So any evidence of his crimes was now done or gone and done away with. He set up a new class of loyal communist officials by basically elevating peasants to come work for him in the bureaucracy, showered them with favors and luxuries, enshrined in their constitution that this new class that he had just elevated was protected against any of the policies that were being forced on the rest of the nation. And he set up a system where the have-nots were now the haves, and they were completely devoted and loyal to him because of the, how should I say this? Because of the stuff he gave them.
Today, Pramila, Debbie, and I are introducing Medicare for All single-payer legislation of care to all Americans, rich, poor, young, or old, with zero out-of-pocket expense. No more insurance premiums, no more deductibles, no more co-payments. Means covering dental care, vision, hearing aids, prescription drugs, and home health care.
Lastly, we're gonna end on Russia right there. We'll get into more in Russia when we talk about the Cold War. But the last thing I want to talk about with Russia, communism in those early days, was the attack on education, religion, and the family. Both Lenin and Stalin did this because they need people to be loyal to the state. And they saw, just like Marx described, family and religion as obstacles to devoted, loyal subjects. So first, education was nationalized, so the state was in charge at every level. Teachers lost authority to enforce discipline in the class, which I thought was interesting because I am a former teacher and worked in the education system for a decade and a half and definitely have seen that happen. Open admissions to colleges were introduced to make sure that anyone, regardless of qualifications, were admitted.
Toga! Toga!
The state now controlled all facets of education, and then they turned their sights to religion. So Lenin nationalized all church property, started with heavy fines and regulation, which then led to arrest of clergy, being accused of things they didn't do. There's mock trials. Basically, they were targeted for being religious because remember, you have to have people who are devoted to the state nothing else. Clergy members were subject to torture, prison camps, executions, or sent to the gulags. Churches were closed, synagogues were desecrated. I did think this was interesting. This is a direct quote from Britannica Encyclopedia. It says, Muslim religious institutions suffered the least because of Lenin's fear of alienating the colonial peoples of the Middle East, on whose support he counted against the Western imperial powers. So if you're confused nowadays why the left, the party of peace and compassion, is openly supporting a terrorist organization that committed the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, if you're confused why they're protesting in the college campuses and in the streets, this is the answer. This is the boiled down, simple answer. Anti-Western imperial powers, or anti-West. Islam is anti-West. Communism is anti-West. Anti-America, anti-Christian. So under Stalin, there was an actual coordinated plan titled the Atheist 5-Year Plan to eliminate God and religion entirely from the Soviet Union. He had churches register, and if they've registered, they were afforded some grace from the government as long as they renounced or publicly refused to criticize communism. Some churches refused to do this, so they did not register, so they had to go underground because they were not able to legally operate if they were not registered. Christians were denied education opportunities, job placements simply for being Christian. They banned the selling and buying of Christmas trees, and they also very much used anti-Christian propaganda. So Julie Beeling created the documentary Beneath Sheep's Clothing with James Lindsay, who I mentioned earlier. It's in my links below this video. I strongly recommend you watch it. So that documentary is based on her book. She was an LDS missionary in the Soviet Union, in Russia in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And she is somewhat of an expert. She is very much an expert in this field. In her book, she shows some of the propaganda that was used at this time. And she explains that there's two methods used to attack Christians. Either they are simple idiots.
Idly-ho, neighborinos.
Or they are abusive zealots.
But she will be mine, or she
Does that sound familiar? So in this poster, you have crazy grandmother. I wasn't sure that was a grandmother. I thought that was a man dragging her daughter to an Orthodox church. And it says, religion is poison, protect the children. This next poster, unwitting, simple-minded citizens risk getting hooked by religious sects. It says, a cunning, well thought out lie. When you die, you'll go to heaven. So either they mock Christians for being stupid or they mock them for being extreme bigots. This was interesting, terrifying, but interesting. Children were removed from the homes of unregistered Christians and sent to state-run boarding schools. At the schools, they really laid the propaganda on thick. For example, one exercise that was used by teachers was the teacher would have the kids close their eyes and ask them to say a prayer and ask God for candy. And when the kids opened their eyes, there was no candy. Then the teacher had them close their eyes again, asked them to ask Uncle Lenin for candy. And while their eyes were closed, she would put a piece of candy on each desk. Kids open their eyes, there's candy. Oh, look at that. Uncle Lenin's great, God's not. Author historian Stephen Miner explained the tactic. He said Stalin saw this as a way of getting rid of a past that was holding people back and marching towards the future of science and progress. I'm going to read that again. Stalin saw this attack on Christianity, all religions, as a way of getting rid of a past that was holding people back and marching towards the future of science and progress. It's estimated during the 70-year communist rule in Russia, 12 to 20 million Christians were either arrested, tortured, imprisoned, killed, or sent to the gulags. Julie Bailing makes this tragic statement about that. She said, anti-religious propaganda, together with secularization is just no religion, and the Soviet state were quite successful overall. First, it succeeded in helping take a previously religiously minded populace and turning them against religion. Second, Soviet propagandists successfully converted the majority of their populace to a secular and godless worldview, viewing their communist society as wholesome, pure, and joyous. Third, Soviet propagandists very successfully otherized those who clung to religious faith, and they came to be viewed as either naive simpletons or dangerous fanatics. Does that sound like today? All right. That was very heavy. We got through Russia. I don't want to leave you feeling depressed or in despair, which is quite common when studying history, when studying these kinds of things. So here at the Go and Do podcast, I want to educate. We've done that. But I also want to edify and empower you. So every episode, I will leave you with an empower, go and do challenge and a happy thought, an uplifting happy thought. So the go and do challenge today that I am issuing to you after all this information was given to you, a lot to chew on. What is something small and manageable that you can do to affect change in your life today, right now? What is it? This is it. Devote more time, daily time, to scripture study. I don't know how else to explain it. As I have done that over the years, my understanding and commitment to the Lord has increased exponentially. Can I tell you how many Hallmark movies I could have watched? How many mindless shows I would have enjoyed rather than studying genocide and communism and some of the worst things in the last 100 years? However, I have found that the scriptures, I read them not because they make me feel warm and fuzzy inside, because they don't always make me feel that. I read them because they teach truths. I read them because they help me understand God's world, and more importantly, a world without God, and helping me start to see patterns and things in history and the scriptures and my own life. If you get nothing else out of this podcast, if you never come back to my podcast again, please take this with you. Make daily focused time in the scriptures a priority in your life. It will change your life. I promise you. If you don't believe me, lean on my testimony for a bit. Try it. So what's my happy thought to end the episode with? Well, we just went through a lot of bondage. Bondage is how you can describe what communism does to a people. It enslaves them. It is a modern form of slavery. And thankfully for us, there has been a solution to that. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, verse 79 and 80, this is what the Lord tells us through his prophet Joseph Smith. Therefore, it is not right that any man should be in bondage one to another. And for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose. Now I know you've got questions and maybe some critiques about the Constitution. We will get into that at later episodes on this podcast. But My fellow saints, from the Lord's mouth to his prophet, he has told us the Constitution is the way. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have it. God gave it to us. That is good news. Take comfort in knowing a plan was already laid out. It was already set forth to prevent people from being in bondage. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next time.